Hello and warm greetings. Welcome to the Analyst by Vajiram and Ravi, where we would try to comprehensively analyze 7 articles into different sections along with a daily mains answer writing program. In the analysis part, we'll first talk about the evolving construct of G2, including United States and China, and possible implications for India and the way forward. Then in the second article, we'll have a discussion with respect to the rising number of accidents across India, the impacts, causes, and the way forward. Then in the simplified section, we'll have a look at 5 different articles from a special perspective of UPSC Prelims 2026 along with the value addition. So stay tuned. Coming to the very first topic of today's discussion, this is the return of bipolarity, G2 and India's road ahead. In the Cold War, the world was divided into 2 power blocks, one led by the United States of America and the other led by the erstwhile USSR. 2 blocks, 2 poles and 2 ideologies. Now this geopolitical theater is again evolving, and what many of the scholars have been saying is that there is the emergence of a shadow of this bipolarity. Now this is not between USA and erstwhile USSR or USA and Russia. Now this is between USA and China, where these 2 countries combined, they are steering the global rules. They are formulating the global rules with respect to the market, the technology. Now, why this is really important for us to understand, especially as Indians, is where does India stand in this particular frame of G2? That is a world order being led by these 2 countries combined, US and China. Very, very important topic of GS2 international relations, and especially those of you who are having PSR as an optional, again, very important topic. What the scholars are saying is in this particular construct, India should significantly invest in its diplomatic outreach and domestic capabilities. So what we'll be doing today is we'll first understand what this particular construct of G2 is all about, what are the evidence that this is manifesting. Then we'll talk about the possible implications, what are the implications for India and for the world, and what should be the way forward for India, and also the opportunities. Very, very important topic. Let's start. Now, what do we mean by G2? That's the very first question. See, the basis of this is the world order, and I have elaborately told about this even earlier sessions, that world order signifies the distribution of power and authority among different countries and institutions around the world, right? So world order is something which continuously evolves. When we are talking about the G2, it talks about that 2 countries are dominating the whole system, are dominating the world system. And these 2 great powers, as of now, what we're talking about is the USA and People's Republic of China, right? Now, they are dominating with respect to the decision making, they are dominating with respect to the functioning of the institutions, and they're also dominating with respect to the material flows. And this is having a significant impact on the global politics, on the global economy, and the technological aspect. That is what you will have to understand. Now, does it mean that it signifies a formal structure? That is, a formal agreement has taken place between US and China? No, not at all. It does not signify a formal structure. What it denotes is a bipolar influence. That is, these 2 countries, as when they feel comfortable, they reach to an agreement, and there is a kind of a bipolar influence on the world politics. Whatever goes around the world, it is influenced by the decisions taken by these 2 countries. There is a kind of a duopoly, right? Duopoly with respect to the decision making. And these 2 countries are basically the most important stakeholders. They decide on these matters. Now, what are the 2 sides of G2? See, whenever we talk about G2, what we feel is that these 2 countries have come together and they're cooperating and they're having very hunky-dory, very good relations. That is not the case. When we are talking about G2, right, it means that it has both the sides of cooperation as well as competition. When we talk about the cooperative aspect, what we'll witness is selective cooperation. USA and China have come together on certain occasions when their self-interest was at stake. That is what the selective cooperation is all about. Let's talk about the recent summit in Busan, right? So when we talk about the selective trade deals, or when we talk about the agricultural supplies, which USA has asked that America would supply agricultural supplies to the China. So the cooperation is selective, not in every domain. But when we talk about the competitive aspect, it is pervasive. Competition is pervasive in almost every domain. You talk about technology, you talk about military, you talk about the emerging technologies, everywhere you would see the competition. There is systemic competition and there is selective cooperation. Use these terms, very important. Again, I'm repeating, there is selective cooperation and there is systemic competition. Now, why there has been the resurgence of this particular idea? Look, we have been witnessing confrontation between US and China, starting from the very first regime of President Trump and his second presidential stint. What we have been observing is that there have been frequent trade wars. Whenever the confrontation reaches to its peak, there have been cases of transactional trade deals or these summits, for example, as I told you in Busan. Now, what you'll have to understand is, whenever these two countries come together, whenever you have Mr. Trump coming and shaking hands with Xi Jinping, what we say is, or what many scholars say is, that these two countries have combined for a purpose. And their purpose is based on their own selfish geopolitical interest. And that is how they are going to dominate in the world politics, including the economy aspect. That is what you will have to understand. And therefore, even now, many of the scholars are saying is that these two countries would come together. They would shape the global rules with respect to the market, with respect to technology, with respect to the politics, and then they would compromise the interests of the other countries. See, this is a very human nature, that if someone achieves a power status, he or she would not want the other person to surpass his abilities. Same thing applies to the nations as well, right? So USA and China would never want a country to surpass or exceed their capacities. That is what you'll have to understand. Now, what is the evidence that G2 dynamic is emerging? A very important thing to understand. The very first is relative material capabilities. You talk about any of the domains, be it technology, be it military, be it any other domain, both these two countries are preeminent powers. USA is always preeminent, but China is rapidly pacing up. It's rapidly catching up the status of the USA. Let's talk about the economy. So when we talk about the economy, just look at this. We have USA and China as the first and the second largest economies in the world. And we have India, it's just taking the position, fourth position. So what you'll have to understand is 30.5 trillion US dollars, the GDP of the US. And then we talk about China, it's almost $20 trillion. So it's huge, it's mammoth, right? Next aspect which you'll have to understand is the military aspect. Both these countries are one of the largest spenders, defense spenders. In 2024, if I give you the data, according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, what it says is in 2024, USA spent almost 997 US billion dollars. Can you just imagine? 997 US billion dollars. And it was almost 37% of the global spending on the defense aspect. In the same year, China spent almost 314 US billion dollars. And this was almost 12% of the global spending. And when we talk about India, the number was almost 86 US billion dollars. It's almost nothing as compared to the US, and it's again very small as compared to that of China. So that is what you'll have to understand. US has one of the top companies when we talk about the defense aspect, and China is rapidly building its indigenous defense platforms. So this is something which we'll have to consider in. Then let's talk about technology aspect. If we factor in the developments which are taking place with respect to the artificial intelligence, DeepSeek, right? Or the other, startups coming. Or let's talk about the cloud computing. Or let's talk about the quantum computing, biotech. These are the two countries who are having the cutting edge research with respect to these domains. And definitely, see, India and the other countries are also having their own research, having their own indigenous base, but it's very minuscule, it's very small when we compare that aspect with these two countries of USA and China. Next aspect is trade and supply chain levers. Whenever we talk about the supply chains with respect to certain key elements, let's talk about the supply chains with respect to the critical minerals. So when we talk about China has a dominance with respect to the rare earth elements. Look at this. When we talk about China's dominance in critical minerals, China controls almost 85 to 90% of the rare earth element. Why these rare earth elements are important? Because these are the foundational stones. These are the most important component when we talk about the emerging technologies. You talk about the electric vehicles, you talk about the battery storage systems, or you talk about the smartphones. All these things, or the developments which are taking place with respect to the data centers, related to the artificial intelligence or machine learning, the hardware which is used, every of these component requires these critical minerals. And China dominates when we talk about the refining aspect and also the processing aspect. That is what you'll have to understand. Almost 60% of the lithium, then almost 68% of the cobalt, and almost 65% of the nickel. So this is the kind of dominance which China has, right? Now, we have just talked about China. What about US? When we talk about the US has an eminent position, a kind of the most important position, the dominant position with respect to the global finance, with respect to the intellectual property. You must have seen the iPhone, designed in California and assembled in China. So the design aspect, when we talk about the semiconductors design aspect, most of the patents are based in the US. So both these countries have a dominance when we talk about the supply chains. That is what you will have to understand. Then technology and standards leadership. When we are talking about the developments which are taking place with respect to the 5G or the 6G, the trials which are going on, or the developments which are taking place with respect to the space research, exploration, who is dominating? It is US and China. You talk about the Chinese Space Agency or you talk about NASA. They are doing the frontier research. The top-notch research is being done in these two countries, right? Now, again, also, one more important aspect is of standards. Why standards are important? Look, let's talk about 5G. So when we have countries doing trials with respect to 5G or let's say 6G, they'll come up with their own standards. We have companies like Huawei, right? Or we have the companies based in US also, which are doing trials with respect to 5G or 6G. Now they would come with their own standards. Now there would be a race between these two countries that which standard should become the global standard. And that is where different countries would have a tough choice. That is what we are talking about, the standards with respect to technology. Then evidence of episodic accommodation. As I told you, there have been continuous periods of confrontation where Mr. Trump has said a lot of times that he's going to impose sanctions. But what we have also seen is periods where these two leaders or these two countries have come together and they have reached to a particular solution. So what we also find is that diplomacy plays a very important role, right? Ultimate solution, as what Mr. Jaishankar, the man who has an exceptional knowledge in the diplomatic aspect. So what he has mostly said is that the solution lies in diplomacy. That is what you will have to understand. Now, this points towards the conclusion that whenever these countries are having a confrontational approach, they ultimately come and sit on the table and then they decide a particular issue, right? So these episodes of coming together, this gives a hint to the world, or it gives a kind of a perception to the world that these two countries would now come together, make the global rules and then dictate the terms to the different countries around the world. Then we have global fragmentation with respect to multilateralism. Very important aspect. We all know what is the condition of these multilateral institutions. You talk about United Nations, even in today's newspaper, we have a particular editorial written by the former Foreign Secretary, where she talks about the condition with respect to the functioning of the United Nations Security Council, right? Where she says that the whole structure is fragmented. Countries are they're taking decision in the United Nations Security Council on the basis of their own geopolitical selfish basis. And that is compromising the global international peace and security, right? So what we are witnessing is a kind of a very weak multilateral structure. You talk about World Health Organization or you talk about World Trade Organization or any of these institutions. The kind of objective they had, it is not being met. Primarily because countries are having they're ideologically different. They're having their own reasons for it. And what we are ultimately witnessing is lack of cooperation. And in this particular scenario, what these countries feel, especially US and China, is to come together and have a bilateral setup. So they're not dependent upon these multilateral institutions, primarily because these multilateral institutions have failed to deliver on the objectives. Then we have geopolitical fatigue and cost. Again, very important thing to understand. Let's say US has imposed sanctions on China. Do you think that it is only impacting Chinese firms? No, not at all. So it also has significant cost for Americans, right? Because once you have, these sanctions being imposed, the cost of the product increases in America, right? So if let's say they're importing and they are importing a lot of commodities from China, right? So that also has an effect on the final price of the commodity. So there are huge costs involved for both these countries. So ultimately, the solution lies in that, okay, after this particular confrontational approach, let's sit together and reach to a particular solution. And that is how many of the scholars are now constituting that this reflects an approach where these two countries are coming together and then dictating the global rules on market, on technology, and on other domains. Next, we have the changing geostrategic map. You talk about the Russia-Ukraine war or what is happening in the Middle East. So these have become prolonged conflicts. Now, what these countries are thinking is possibly that they should divert their attention from these issues and rather focus upon the important areas. And we already know that which is the most important area for President Trump. It's the trade aspect. And that is the reason he has been using trade as a bargaining chip with different countries. So what you'll have to understand is, since these issues are not being resolved, be it the Russia-Ukraine war primarily through the United Nations, and the Israel-Palestine conflict. But see, again, a truce has been agreed, a ceasefire has been agreed when we talk about the Israel-Palestine issue. But again, the things are very fragile on the ground. And that is the reason these countries, what they think is that rather than focusing more on these issues, rather combine together, talk and sit and let's decide on these matters. And that is how many scholars have been saying that there is an aspect of G2 where these two countries would make decisions, would take decisions basis on their own selfish geopolitical interests, and that would compromise the interests of the other countries, right? What does it characterizes? It characterizes the fluidity. What it means is that when we talk about a formal duopoly, that is not there, right? We cannot say that there is a formal duopoly where these two countries are always, they are taking the decision. No, sometimes we also have the other players who are taking decisions, or countries coming together on multilateral setups. Or we also cannot say that there is constant cooperation, right? There is no constant cooperation and there is no formal duopoly, right? They are coming together sometimes taking calls primarily based upon their own national interests, but there is no phase of constant cooperation. That is what you will have to understand. But in the whole picture, what becomes really important is to see that whatever they are doing, it is primarily based upon their own interests. And some way or the other, it is compromising the interests of the other countries, primarily the middle powers, right? What are the global implications of a G2? The very first is bifurcation and fragmenting globalization. What does it mean? Have you heard about the word splinternet? Now, what does it signify, splinternet? That there is a conception of the internet where internet works within the national boundaries. See, right now we have internet as a global phenomena, right? There are no boundaries which exist. But when we talk about countries having their own boundaries with respect to the usage of internet, that is what we call as splinternet. Now, the same thing goes with the supply chains. What is happening is that if these two countries, they combine, or when they basically dictate, or when they compete with each other, it basically creates a bifurcation in the market. It creates a bifurcation with respect to the standards of technology. It creates bifurcation with respect to the supply chains, be it technology, be it the rare earth elements. So that is something which you'll have to understand. And it also fragments the globalization. See, when we talk about the world as a global village, what we are saying is that there should not be any hindrances with respect to the flow of people, flow of capital, flow of goods and services. But when we look at this particular aspect, when sometimes these two powers cooperate and sometimes, and in most of the cases, they compete with each other, that is what creates a bifurcation with respect to the markets, with respect to the supply chain, with respect to technologies. Then we have diminished multilateralism or selective multilateralism. Look, if these two countries, which are the dominant powers in the world, if they would not show their interest in these multilateral organizations, be it the WHO or the WTO, what would be left with respect to the credibility of these institutions? So that is something which you'll have to understand, that if these two countries themselves are opting for bilateral setups, especially US has in true sense no interest and no belief in the working of these multilateral organizations. So this, in a way, it diminishes the multilateralism, or it basically fosters selective multilateralism, that on certain issues we will cooperate but not on the others. Then we have pressures on the middle part. Let's talk about India as a country. Now, India shares a land border with China, but India also has close relations with the US. Now, let's say in this particular setup, let's say technological race is going on and US develops its own technological standard, be it with respect to 6G or be it with respect to any technology. And China, on the other hand, develops its own. So what options India has? Because China has been using trade. China has been restricting the supplies of the rare earth element so that it can pressurize different countries, what it is doing with US. So it can also pressurize India. So it creates a tough situations for the middle class especially, right? Let's talk about Germany or let's talk about Japan. So these countries, though they may be inclined towards the US ideologically, but they still are critically dependent with respect to the supplies of commodities on China. That is what you will have to understand. Then we have potential for managed stability but also instability. Little bit complex, but again, very important. When these two countries, they come together, let's say the recent summit in Busan, when Mr. Trump met with Xi Jinping, it offers a ray of hope for different countries around the world, right? And that's the reason many of the times what we have seen is whenever these two countries come together, whenever a kind of a collaborative mechanism is set up, we see the reflection of it in the stock markets, right? But what you'll have to understand is, do they include the views of the other countries? Let's say they are deciding with respect to a very important aspect of technology. They're deciding on how the rules would be made with respect to artificial intelligence, or let's say cloud computing. If they do not include other countries, it makes the whole situation very fragile and it may lead to instability. That is what you'll have to understand, that they are not incorporating the views and opinions of the other countries. Then we have geographic hotspots and proxy pressures. What you will have to understand is, especially when we talk about Indo-Pacific, see what I'm trying to give you examples and trying to make you understand is because IR is a subject where you cannot really memorize much. What you'll have to understand is you'll have to look at the picture, see that particular event, and then come to the conclusion. Now, when we look at the Indo-Pacific, or when we look at Latin American countries or Southeast Asia's, the countries around these regions, in these particular zones, they are thirsty for infrastructure projects. They need funds. They're having a want of funds with respect to the infrastructure projects, or they're having their own security issues. So they want to come in close security collaborations. And in this particular environment, these regions of Indo-Pacific, Latin America, and Southeast Asian countries, they offer a very good competition for these two countries. And that is how what we also say is the manifestation of aggression. You must have seen why the US is using Quad, primarily to basically contain China. In where? In the Indo-Pacific region. So why? Because there are countries, a kind of an artificial security threat is being created. And that in a way, that basically makes these countries to either come into the lap of US or come into the lap of China. And that is what creates security issues, right? So there can be proxy pressures, like what we saw when we had this, for example, the US-Vietnam War. Or for example, we had the issues with respect to North Korea and South Korea, where different countries, either they took the side of the US or they took the side of the erstwhile USSR. Same thing is happening in this particular construct. Now, what G2 means for India and implications. The very first is the border and regional security. When we talk about the strategic and security implications, and the first is the border and regional security. We'll have to understand that India shares a land border with China, and it has its own security issues. Now, let's say if US and China, they're breaking a deal, they're coming together, and if China basically places condition on the US that it would not interfere in this particular aspect of the border situation between India and the US, then this would make the security situation very fragile for Indians. Understand that thing. Because these two countries, if they come together and decide on particular issue, and if China basically puts a condition that USA would not interfere, then this would marginalize the security interests of India. It would compromise the security interests of India because India already shares a very strong defense partnership with the US. Next is great power bargaining risk. So again, the same thing. For the other important issues, let's say what is happening in Afghanistan. Let's say China and the US come together and they decide on Afghanistan. Or let's say they decide with respect to the trade aspect or climate aspect, ignoring the concerns of India. So that would compromise the interests of India. Then we have intense defense and security partnership. Very important to understand. The economy of US is one of the very important components of the economy of US is the military industrial complex. There are very big industrial powerhouses with respect to the military aspect, which manufacture these defense platforms. Let's talk about Lockheed Martin, or let's talk about the other companies like Boeing or General Dynamics. Now, these countries have a dominance with respect to the manufacturing of these defense platforms. US basically creates a hype. It creates a security situation for different countries. As I told you, when we talk about the Indo-Pacific construct. So that the countries come in closer partnerships with the US, and they buy these defense platforms, because in a way that is going to boost the defense industry of the US and ultimately the economy of the US. That is what is happening today, and we'll also study that Mr. Rajnath Singh, the defense minister of India, has signed a particular partnership with the US Secretary of War, right? Why? Because ultimately, the US is going to supply a lot of defense platform, and that in a way is going to boost the economy of the US. You'll have to look at the big picture, right? Next is the strategic and security implications. The very first is trade and investment risks. Why this is a particular concern for India? Because once the supply chain evolves, India would have to take a decision whether to align with the US-centric supply chains or the China-centric supply chains. And this would inevitably create pressure with respect to the trade aspect, right? Or with respect to the investment, because we are, even till now, we are critically dependent upon the investments from the other countries, primarily the US or the other countries. So we need a lot of investments. But when in this situation, which is evolving, when you have these two players taking their own decisions, India would be in a tough situation. Next, we have export and market opportunities. Now, this also gives a positive hope. Why? Because in this particular situation, we have many countries around the world who have their manufacturing base in China, but they want to now diversify. For example, they are diversifying in countries like Vietnam or Bangladesh. Now, this is a moment for India, what we call as economic decoupling, where India can go with friendshoring. We can have an approach where countries now start, those countries which are looking for alternatives, they can start investing in India. That is what you'll have to understand. So this also gives the opportunities to India to diversify, right? And it gives the opportunities to different countries to diversify their options. Then we have critical minerals and technologies. Very important. China can use this particular thing of its dominant position with respect to the refining and processing of the critical minerals as a bargaining chip, which it has already been doing. Because India is also slowly enhancing or increasing its base with respect to critical technologies, be it the semiconductors or be it the artificial intelligence. India is coming up with the data centers, right? So we also need the supply of these rare earth elements. But in this particular situation, China can use it as a bargaining chip. Then we have technology, standards, and digital sovereignty. I think we've already discussed with respect to the standards war. So there is a kind of a war which is going with respect to the kind of standards we would have for the technology, be it the 5G or the cloud computing or the artificial intelligence, right? So in this particular war, we'll have to basically decide that should we basically abide the America-centric standards or should we abide the Sino-centric standards, right? Then we have data flows and digital autonomy. Now, see how you'll have to see this picture. India has been focusing upon data localization aspect, right? Where we are saying that we need to have digital sovereignty. We need to have control with respect to our own data. But in this particular evolving scenario, where data is the new gold, it's the new oil, where different countries want data primarily to have an edge with respect to technologies like artificial intelligence. Because what is the most important ingredient, or which is something, the kind of blood for the artificial intelligence? It's basically the data. So these countries are critically dependent on data, but India is focusing upon data localization, so it may be pressurized. India can be pressurized that it must open its borders with respect to the data, and the data must be freely, it should be interoperable and it should be allowed to flow freely across the borders. So this can compromise the digital sovereignty aspect of India also. Then we have diplomacy and multilateralism. Now, we have often talked about this strategic autonomy, right? Where we often say that India's interests are based, India's decisions are based on its own national interests, and we do not have an alliance kind of mindset, and we do not take sides. We take the sides when we feel that yes, this party is correct and this party should be supported. Now, in this particular situation, the strategic autonomy principle would be tested more. So what we'll have to understand is we'll have to basically come with a more pragmatic approach. We cannot just take sides. We cannot say that no, we'll support US or we'll support China. We'll have to be pragmatic. Next aspect is elevated diplomatic role. Again, important to understand. Why? Because in this situation, you'll have to look in a positive manner. This gives India a position to act as a bridge between these two countries or to act as the voice of the global South. Because ultimately, the future lies, for example, in countries in the continents of Africa, right? Where we are witnessing a kind of a population boom, right? So over here, it's really important for India to act as a voice of these countries, to support those initiatives which are linked with these countries of Latin America, of Africa, or Southeast Asia. Now, what are the opportunities for India? The very first is that India should be seen as a kind of a player. See, we cannot ignore the fact that India is a very important critical market for both these countries of US and China. And when we talk about the Indo-Pacific construct, please understand, it's a very dependable player for US, right? A dependable partner where US can trust that yes, we have a country like India which can basically go as per the kind of the values which they basically go for, right? Free international rules based order, or the freedom of navigation, right? Open lines, open sea lines of communication. So what you'll have to understand is that India's position is very critical for both these countries. Next, we have economic reorientation. Economic reorientation is being sought by various companies around the world, various multinational companies, primarily who are in the domain of the manufacturing aspect. They are looking for alternatives. They're looking for economic decoupling. They do not want to be critically dependent on China. They're looking for diversification. And over here, India basically is a very important silver lining for these countries. Next, we have leadership for Global South. Again, as I said, in this particular environment, we should rather focus upon the concerns which are related to the countries of the Global South. And we also discussed in one of the analysts what this construct of Global South means, right? So that is where the importance lies. That is where the growth lies. That is where the future lies. So we should also invest in these countries of Global South. Then we have technological leapfrogging. We need to focus upon developing the indigenous base. We cannot be dependent upon the kind of technologies which US has. That is the reason what we are witnessing is a kind of a rapid boom with respect to the AI technological base. India is one of the countries which is having one of the largest patents with respect to the AI, and it's a very good news, right? So we are focusing upon developing our own indigenous base. Then what should be the way forward for India? The very first, when we talk about the short to medium term measures, when we talk about the next 1 to 5 years, the very first is consolidate strategic autonomy with clarity. See, we have been already following this principle of strategic autonomy, but it needs to be made more pragmatic. How we can do? By coming up with close partnerships with the countries like US, with Japan, with EU, and also maintaining functional relations with China. See, we share a land border with China. We cannot ignore this fact, right? And we also have a huge power asymmetry. Even now, we have a huge power asymmetry between that of China and that of India, right? Next aspect is defense and deterrence. Very important. We need to significantly invest in building the capacity, force modernization, especially in this particular border areas, right? For example, in the form of the advanced landing grounds, right? Or in the form of, let's say, coming up with the mountaineering force, right? Force modernization. That is really very important. Then economic resilience and supply chain diversification. When we talk about the economy, see, ultimately, it is the economy which shapes the political choices of different countries. When we are talking about the economy, if our economy is strong, definitely India would emerge as a superpower, right? Economic resilience and supply chain diversification. We need to incentivize the import substitution. When we are talking about the import substitution, here we are talking about, for example, let's talk about the active pharmaceutical ingredients. We are critically dependent on China for these. Why not manufacture in our own country? Or let's talk about the refining and processing aspect of critical minerals. We need to basically go for import substitution, right? Next, we have market access and the foreign direct investment. We need to basically invite other countries to invest in critical domains. Let's talk about the electric vehicles, or let's talk about the battery storage systems. There needs to be an investment in these emerging areas. That is really very important. Then let's talk about the trade and investment diplomacy. When we talk about these countries in the global south, India should basically provide them the soft lines of credit. See, the kind of perception which Chinese enterprises have in Africa, it's not good. Because these enterprises, they have been exploiting the natural resources of the countries in the African region. But India has a very good perception. There is a kind of a soft power which we have. So we need to capitalize upon that aspect. Be it the countries of Latin America or Southeast Asian countries, or let's say the countries, even the neighboring countries. India should basically start giving the soft lines of credit, and it should also invest in the infrastructure development. See, we did a lot in Afghanistan. be it the hydropower projects or be it the parliament building or the others. We should also go with this approach for the other countries, right? Then we have built strategic inventories and stockpiles. In this particular environment, where there is a constant risk that the supply chains can be basically stopped at any moment of time, what we witnessed during the COVID times, that supply chains were completely cut off because countries, almost every country on this planet was critically dependent upon the supply chains based in China. And that is how it gave, an economic blow. So what we need to go with is a kind of a diversification. That is really very important. And in addition to the diversification, we need to have our own reserves. For example, India has been investing in the strategic petroleum reserves, SPR. So that is again very important. Or let's say the exploration. Why not invest more in the exploration of these critical minerals? Or the other aspect of having the refining and processing capacities. Why not invest in the recycling aspect? We already have a lot of electronic gadgets which is in that waste mode. Why not take out the important critical minerals from those used electronic products? For that, we need to develop the recycling technology, right? Then we have medium to long term technological and R&D push. Very, very important. Because ultimately these countries, be it China, see, China started doing the reverse engineering, and that is the reason it has basically attained a dominant position. So we'll also have to invest in the technological domain. When we are talking about the technological aspect, we need to have close interactions between the universities and the companies, the industries. We need to come up with more interactive platforms where these universities, the college institutions, they must basically provide that education which is really required by the industries, or focus upon the high value manufacturing, be it the kind of hardware which is to be used in the data centers, or the machines which are to be used for machine learning or artificial intelligence or cloud computing, whatever. So that must be done. Then in talent retention is very important. Most of the brilliant scientists who are working in US, either they are of Chinese origin or they are of Indian origin. So why not give them the retention incentives so that we can retain in India, we can retain them in India itself, and then we can optimize the kind of capacities they have. So that is really very important. That whole environment needs to be provided. Then we have financial and digital sovereignty. How we can develop the financial sovereignty, right? See, still we are in need of funds. But what we can do is we can basically make sure that our forex reserves are strong. So that a condition like the earlier one, like the balance of payment crisis we had, that should not re-emerge. We need to significantly invest in the forex aspect. Then we have digital sovereignty. How we can do so? By having our own rules, our own rules with respect to the data, right? So definitely data localization might act as a hindrance. But again, what we have to focus upon is having our own rules, which basically incentivize the different industries to come up with their own technologies, and therefore we'll be able to come up with our own standards, right? Then we have multilateral leaderships. For example, we can come up with the like-minded countries of the global south, or we can come in the issue-based coalitions with respect to the climate change or artificial intelligence. You must have heard about the Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence, GPAI. Or let's talk about the trade aspect. So there has to be a coalition of like-minded countries, primarily the countries of global south. Then we have domestic reforms for competitiveness. We need to have robust reforms with respect to land, labor, logistics. We need to make the whole atmosphere more competitive. We need to incentivize the MSMEs, the lifeblood of the Indian economy, right? We need to basically make sure that we end the regulatory hurdles. That is where the reform measures are very important. Then we have human capital and skill development, the most important part. We'll have to invest in the higher education. We'll have to make sure that we have new courses. We come up with courses which deal with the new and emerging technologies in different institutes. So right now we have these courses, but in limited colleges. We need to also incorporate the practical aspects of these technologies, not just the theoretical aspects. Invest in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So that is something which is really important. See, again, in this particular construct, what we'll have to understand is that this G2 construct, it signifies cooperation sometimes, but there is a systemic competitive spirit which is there between these two countries. And whenever these countries come together, whenever they strike a kind of a trade deal or a bargain with each other, then that can compromise the interests of the other countries. And over here, building a domestic capacity, a domestic base with respect to the diplomatic outreach, with respect to the technology, with respect to the financial aspect, the data aspect, the technological aspect is very important for India. And also what we'll have to understand is, as famously said by Lord Palmerston, that there are no permanent enemies, no permanent friends, only permanent interests. That is what even US has followed. And that is what even the former Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, used to say, that America has no permanent friends or enemies. It only has permanent interest. So we don't have that kind of selfish mentality. But again, India is gaining that realism in its foreign policy approach. What we have to understand is we need to cooperate, especially with the countries of the global south. We need to have the issue-based coalitions with like-minded countries, and we need to basically continue the partnership we have with the US, with Japan, or with EU, and also maintain that functional relation with China, because that is also very important. Let's have a mains practice question. What is the concept of a G2? In global politics, geopolitics, discuss the possible implications of the emergence of a US-China G2 for India, suggests a strategic way forward for India in this context. Very important question. I know this particular topic took a lot of time, but again, it's very important to understand the nitty-gritties, the background of the whole story. And if you are liking the initiative, do not forget to press the like button and also let us know in the comments. Let's go to the next topic. Coming to the next topic, this is with respect to India's deadly roads, challenges and solutions. So what we have been witnessing is increasing number of cases with respect to the road accidents, and many people have compromised their lives. In a very tragic incident which has taken place in Andhra Pradesh, more than 19 people have been killed in a sleeper bus and their bodies were charred to death. Now, what you'll have to understand is that when we talk about national highways in particular, we have been focusing upon the development and maintenance of the national highway, and we have done a tremendous good job with respect to these national highways. But there is again a sad part to it. The number of cases with respect to the accidents, especially on the national highways, it's increasing. According to the data of the government itself, in the first half of 2025, more than 25,000 people have been killed on the national highways itself. In the very first 6 months of 2025, more than 25,000 people have been killed. Please understand, it's a data by the government, so it's a conservative data, right? Maybe not every death is reported. So that is what you'll have to understand, that the situation is very grim. The next point is that national highways, they just share 2% of the total road network in the country, but they account for more than 40% of the total transport. So there is a kind of a disproportionate burden on the national highways when we talk about the traffic aspect. They share just 2% of the total network, but more than 40% of the traffic flows on the national highways. And more than 30% of the deaths, they basically take place on national highways. So there needs to be a proper policy with respect to the functioning of these national highways. And we'll have to basically adopt both the short-term as well as the long-term measures. Very important topic from the GSU. Now, what you'll have to understand is, according to the World Health Organization, every year, globally, more than 1.2 million people die. Almost 12 lakh people die because of the cases with respect to the road accidents. Now, if you just look at this particular estimate, in 2023 alone, more than 1.72 lakh people were killed in India. Again, I'm telling you that this is a government estimate. So maybe it's a conservative estimate. There are many cases where there is underreporting, right? So those cases might not be included in the list of the tragedies, in the list of the accidents. So according to many of the non-governmental organizations, in India, almost 3 lakh people die. 3 lakh people die on an annual basis with respect to the road accidents. Now, what it means is, if 4 people are dying globally with respect to the road accidents, 1 out of 4 people is an Indian. That highlights the tragic situation with respect to the country, right? If you can just also look at this particular data, that we have number of pedestrians killed. There were more than 35,000 in the year 2023. Number of two-wheelers riders killed. They were almost 77,500 in 2023, right? Let's also talk about persons killed for not wearing the helmet. It's almost 54,000. Persons killed for not wearing the seat belt, 16,000. Persons killed below the age of 18 years, 10,000. Again, very important data which I would like to give you. According to the estimate, the people who are dying, right, the people who are dying in the road accidents, if you take the age bracket from 18 to 45 years of age, they account almost 67% of the people who are dying. And if you increase this age bracket from 18 to 60 years of age, what you will notice is almost 83% of the people who are dying, they belong to this particular age bracket, from 18 to 60 years of age. What it means is that we are losing that important demographic dividend, the young population, which is critically important for the economic development of the country. right? So we are basically losing that critical resource. India from 2009 to 2019, according to a research done by IIT Delhi, what it says is that the road accident, it is the 13th largest contributor with respect to the health burden. We'll talk about what this health burden is all about. Now, what are the major causes of road accidents in 2021? So we have speeding, one of the most important causes. Then we have dangerous or reckless driving. Reckless driving, if you combine with the speeding aspect, it's almost responsible for more than 70% of the road accidents. That is what you'll have to understand. Also look at this particular thing, that which is a segment of the society which is most affected. Let's look at the two-wheelers, so many numbers, or let's look at the bicycle users, or let's look at the pedestrians, right? So what we call these people as vulnerable road users, especially belonging to the lower socio-economic state of the society. So they are the ones who primarily either they suffer grievous injuries or they die in the road accidents. That is what you'll have to understand. Now, what are the causes of high road accidents in India? The very first, I already told you, it's the reckless driving and over speeding. People do not follow the rules. They are basically driving at a much faster pace. Now, if you have a particular vehicle which is basically moving with a very great speed, then the chances of crash increase. It might crash into a lorry or it might crash into a stationary object. And then that would lead to, basically that might lead to the accident, and ultimately the person might succumb. So that is one of the very important things. More than, as I told you, around 70% of the cases with respect to deaths are attributable to the reckless driving and overspeeding. Then we have non-compliance with the traffic laws. When we talk about crossing the red light or overspeeding, not wearing the seat belts, right? So that is something which you'll have to understand. People do not obey the laws. People do not obey the rules and regulations. That is one of the very important factors. Or overloading. You must have seen the lorries carrying that gravel and that cement and everything. So they are having a huge load on them. And once they move with a great speed, there is a kind of an instability which is induced. And once there is instability, definitely it might collapse. And once it would collapse, definitely it might also affect the other vehicles plying on the road. So that is something which you'll have to understand. Then we have infrastructure deficiencies. On the roads and even on some parts of the national highways, there is absence of the signages. There are a lot of potholes. Roads and lanes are not clearly marked. So there are deficiencies with respect to the infrastructure, and that is one of the also leading causes of the accidents. Then we have insufficient lighting. What we're trying to say, that even on some stretches on the national highways, there is no light or there's insufficient light. And what it does is that the driver is unable to basically have a clear marked lane. And there have been many cases where the cars, they fall off from the cliff areas, primarily because of the insufficient lighting, right? So that must be factored in. Then we have lack of robust monitoring. See, whatever data we have with respect to the number of people who are dying, they're based on surveys. It's not the data which is exact. So there are issues with respect to the data also. There is no proper effective monitoring. There are cases where people die on the roads and it's not even reported. So for every policy, if we need to come up with a robust policy, there has to be at the base a very robust data. That is missing. Then we have vehicle related issues. Even, the people, the generation is focusing upon having those good quality vehicles, which has a standardized format. But again, what we are seeing is that still we have this issue of legacy fleet, where many of these vehicles, they're not abiding or they're not basically to that standard of safety. For example, they might not be using the safety seat belts, or let's say there might not be the presence of the ABS systems or the airbags. So that compromises, that basically increases the risk with respect to the person who is driving the car, right? Or that particular vehicle. Substandard engineering and old technology. So we have the global NCAP. So we have a particular charity known as Towards Zero Foundation. So it basically comes with a car assessment program. So we also have in India the Bharat NCAP, right? What you'll have to understand. But still we have a lot of vehicles which are not adhering to that kind of standard, which is really mandated. Then we have lack of awareness. People are not really aware, or they don't want to accept this particular fact. So we have had many surveys where it was asked that whether wearing a seatbelt is important if you're flying in the city areas. So people said no. More than 85% people said that no, wearing seatbelt is not really important in the city areas. So that is a kind of perception which people have, right? Next, we have what is the impact of road accidents in India. The very first is injuries and disabilities. Now, this is something that it compromises the very effectivity, the efficiency, and the whole life of the person. Because in the accidents, what usually happens is people suffer from grievous injuries, maybe the brain injuries, the spinal cord injuries. In many cases, there are amputations, the legs are cut off, the hands are cut off. So that affects the person very badly. And in many cases, you have the young population, as I already told you, more than 83% of the people who are being killed in the road accidents, they belong to the age bracket of 18 to 60 years of age. So this is again something which is compromising the overall potential of the country. It also adds to the disability adjusted life years. So this is a concept given by the World Health Organization, where it factors in two things. That is the years lived with disability and the years of life lost. Let's say if you have a particular person who has at the age of, let's say, 50, or let's say the age of 45, suffers a particular grievous injury, maybe the amputation or something. So you have this disease or disability. Or let's say if a person dies over here. So these are the early death. So that is how we basically also include this part of the global burden of diseases. Psychological trauma. So the person who suffers an accident, he suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder, even the family members. So this is again a psychological barrier. Then we have the loss of loved ones. Because especially when we talk about the pedestrians or the bicyclists or the two-wheelers, they belong to the socio-economic strata, the socio-economic strata, which is very fragile, which is very vulnerable. And once you have the loss of people who is the sole breadwinner of the family, it is an irreversible loss. That is what you'll have to understand. Then we have the social inequality and exclusion, as I told you. So we have the pedestrians or the cyclists or the riders of the two-wheelers. They suffer the most. So if, let's say, we have a BMW or a Mercedes, it's ramming into the people. So nothing would happen to the driver who's basically driving that particular car. But the people would be killed. So we have the people from the low socioeconomic strata who are the worst sufferers of these road accidents. Then we have the loss of productivity and income. Let's say a person suffers an accident or he suffers a particular injury. He'll not be able to contribute economically. He'll not be able to go to the workplace. And that would compromise the overall potential of the country. According to an estimate, almost the road accidents, it leads to the loss of almost 5 to 7% of GDP. Then we have high healthcare and legal costs. We're not just talking about the cost which is incurred by that particular person, but we're also including the cost which is incurred by the private agencies, insurance companies, or the state. Right? So this is something which you'll have to understand, not just the out-of-pocket expenditure of the individual. Right? So according to the estimate of the government itself, when a person dies in the road accident, there is almost a cost of 91 lakhs. And this data is from 2018. So if you just include the inflation aspect, it would be more than a crore. If a person suffers from a particular injury, the total cost incurred is more than 4 to 5 lakhs. Again, the data is from 2018. So it would be, quite more than that as of now. So that is something which you'll have to understand. It's not just a cost with respect to that individual, but also a cost with respect to the private enterprises, the insurance companies, and the state. You can also just look at the kind of losses which the accidents have, right? Now, what are the initiatives which have been taken with respect to the road safety? The very first is Brasilia Declaration, again very important, of 2015. What it basically said is that we'll take steps to realize the vision which have been mandated in the Sustainable Development Goal 3.6. which says that we will halve the number of people who are suffering the grievous injuries and halve the number of people who are suffering, who are basically dying in the road accidents by 2030, right? Then we have Decade of Action for Road Safety, 2001 till 2030, taken by the United Nations. Then we have the Initiative on the Road Assessment Program. Again, it's a non-governmental organization. It's working upon in those countries, whichever are the stretches of the roads which are non-compliant, which are having safety issues. So it basically funds the projects in order to increase the safety aspect of those particular stretches. Now, what have been the initiatives taken in India? So we had a very important committee known as the Sundar Committee on Road Safety. What it recommended was that we need to have a proper structure, and the structure should begin at the national level. So we need to come up with the National Road Safety and Traffic Management Board. At the state level, we should have the State Road Safety and the Traffic Management Board. We need to have a National Road Safety Policy, and in line with this, the government accepted this particular thing, and we came up with a National Road Safety Policy, which has 4 components: promoting the awareness with respect to wearing the seatbelt, for example, or let's say the establishing the road safety information database, again very important, inculcating technology, integrating technology, enforcement of safety laws, encouraging the safer road infrastructure. So that is what you'll have to understand. Safer road infrastructure in a sense of design of the roads, right? National database and dedicated highway police. This is again very important thing. We have a very less personal, with respect to the road safety aspect, right? So we need to increase the personnel with respect to the road safety. Then we had the Motor Vehicles Amendment Act. So it has primarily three aspects. The very first is increasing the penalties with respect to the traffic violations. Second is basically coming up with the National Road Safety Management Board, coming up with the various policies. Third is constituting the Road Safety Fund, so that we can utilize this fund for enhancing the safety aspects on the road. Then we had Supreme Court coming up with a particular committee under the chairmanship of Justice K.S. Radhakrishnan, primarily which deals with the drink and drive aspect. So we have almost 2.8% people who die in the road accidents. They are under the influence of some form of substance or alcohol. So what happens is, if you have a particular person who is basically under some substance abuse or under the influence of substance abuse or under the influence of alcohol, what it does is it basically retards the ability of the person to coordinate. It retards the judgment ability of the person, and then this increases the chances of the crashes. Then we have Supreme Court in 2017 coming up with the directives that states must constitute the state road safety councils to come up with the various policy initiatives. Road safety fund, we've already done that. Road safety education must be given. So that is what the whole initiative aspect is. What should be the way forward? We need to focus upon the safe driving techniques. Very important, right? So still we have many people who have the driving license, but they do not know even how to ride a bicycle. So that is a kind of status we have. So we need to have a proper mechanism that we only give driving license to those people who really know how to ride a particular two-wheeler or how to drive a particular car or any other vehicle. So there have to be the strict enforcement of the rules, and vehicle maintenance must also be focused upon. Very important component. Then we have raising the awareness and strict enforcement. Strict enforcement is possible only if we have a good number of personnel. That's the first thing. Second thing is the safety audit are also very important. What we are trying to say is that we need to inculcate the safety aspect in the whole design format. Let's say a particular bridge is being constructed or a road is being constructed. The safety aspects must be made an integral component, and audits must take place with respect to whether those things have been integrated properly or not. Then we have the infrastructure improvement, the same thing. Making sure that the lanes are clearly marked, making sure that there is proper lighting on the road, the potholes are removed, right? Improved vehicle safety, as what countries have been doing in the European Union. So they have been focusing upon making sure that the vehicles are robust. Even if a vehicle suffers from an accident, the people must not die, right? So they have the safety features, be it the ABS systems or the airbags or whatever. So those must be incorporated in an Indian system also. Then we have national database and technology integration. You must have heard about the intelligent transport monitoring system, right? Management system, sorry. So we have ITMS. So we need to integrate technology. We cannot do for every road in India, but we can at least do it for some of the important stretches on the national highways, so that we know that which vehicle is crossing over speeding, or we can just catch the person at the right moment. We can penalize that particular person, right? Then we have emergency care services. You must have heard about the golden hour. So it's the very first hour after the accident takes place, where the chances of survival are the most. So we need to come up with the emergency care services near these national highways, so that the life of the persons can be saved. So what we are saying is that these cases have been increasing. And again, what you'll have to understand, there are multiple factors for it, right? So we must focus upon these things. We must incorporate these things. It must be made a part of the awareness in schools and education, in colleges, everywhere. And there have to be strict penalties for that, no doubt about it. And we need to have a comprehensive approach, right? And we need to also have a specific approach with respect to national highways, because they are bearing the brunt of the most number of accident cases. That is what you'll have to understand. Let's have a mains practice question. Despite various legislative measures and awareness campaigns, road accidents continue to be a major cause of fatalities in India. Identify the key factors contributing to the road accidents and suggest a multi-pronged strategy to enhance the road safety in India. 15 marks, 250 words. Do write a particular answer on this question. Coming to the simplified section, we have the first topic, which talks about the Aabhar online store. Now, see, we have the government e-marketplace portal. Now, the GEM portal has come up with this Aabhar online store, which would basically showcase the products which are manufactured by the indigenous tribals and the hand weavers, which are under the overall framework of the one district, one product and the geographical indicators aspect. Again, the whole objective is to promote the inclusive growth, inclusive development. Now, Indian Railways has also supported this particular thing. In a bid to promote the local talent, the Indian Railways will patronize the newly launched Aabhar online store that will showcase the range of exquisite gift items manufactured by the indigenous tribes, handloom weavers and others under the ambit of one district, one product and geographical indication products. The online store hosted by the government e-marketplace sources gifts exclusively from the Central Cottage Industrial Emporium, Khadi and Village Industries Commission, KVIC, very important statutory body, and various central and state craft and handloom emporiums. Promoted with the vocal for local. See, we have been, Prime Minister has also been focusing upon the indigenous or what you can say is Atmanirbhar Bharat, self-reliant India, right? So that is the whole component. The store would offer a variety of articles and hampers that could be used for and at the official events, ceremonies and functions. The objective is to promote the social inclusion and encourage local artisans and traditional industries. The purpose of the initiative was to promote the India's rich heritage through the handloom, handicrafts, artisanal goods by providing market access to the local artisans, rural entrepreneurs and women-led enterprises. So what you'll have to understand, the overall objective of the government is to primarily cater to this particular vulnerable sections, the tribals, the women, the self-help groups led by the women, so that they have this particular market access, they get this particular economic opportunity, and then they can have their own productive livelihood opportunities. The GM is aimed at supporting a sustainable and inclusive economic development to provide a market for the local and indigenous products and create additional income opportunities for the marginalized sections of the society. The Railways has launched one station, one product in line with the one district and one product over its network a few years ago, where articles like artifacts made by the indigenous tribes, handlooms by the local weavers, and handicrafts like chicken curry were showcased. Now let's talk about the GEM portal. It was launched in 2016 by the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. The very aim, the objective is to develop a dedicated digital e-commerce platform, a portal for the mandatory procurement and sale of the goods and services by the center and the state government's organization. Look, government is also a major buyer of different goods and services. So when the government comes up with this particular platform, it gives opportunity to a lot of the MSMEs and the self-help groups. So that is the reason the GM portal is very, very important. The objective is to establish a transparent, efficient and inclusive procurement ecosystem, making sure that some incentives are given to the MSMEs or the other sections, replacing the traditional Directorate General of Supplies and Disposals. Other features: automated rule-based enforcement of the MSME provisions, advanced analytics for decision support, fraud and anomaly detection, faceless transparent procurement process concealing the seller identity. That is what you'll have to understand. Let's also talk about the KVIC. It's the statutory body. The KVIC, the Khadi and Village Industries Commission, is a statutory body established by the Act of the Parliament. And this is it. The very objective of the board is the social objective of providing the employment, the economic objective of providing the saleable articles, the wider objective of creating self-reliance amongst the poor and building of a strong rural community spirit. That is what you'll have to understand. Most important point is that this is a statutory body. Let's also talk about the One District, One Product program launched by the Ministry of Food Processing Industries in 2018. The objective is to help the districts reach their full potential, foster economic and socio-cultural growth. See, every district has its own speciality. So why not capitalize upon that? And that's the reason we have also come up with this particular program of vocal for local, right? So that would, in a way, give a boost to the local manufacturing capacity and create employment opportunities, especially in the rural areas. The initiative aims to turn every district in India into an export hub through the promotion of the product in which the district specializes. The initiative plans to accomplish this by scaling the manufacturing, increasing the manufacturing base, providing the incentives, supporting the local businesses, finding the potential foreign customers, and so on, and therefore helping to achieve the Atmanirbhar Bharat vision. The ODOP initiative, One District, One Product initiative, has identified a total of 1,102 products from 761 districts across the country. The initiative is carried out with the districts as exports hub, because ultimately the very objective is to increase the exports, to have an export-led economy. By the Directorate General of Foreign Trade, Department of Commerce. What is the process? Under the ODOP initiative, all the products have been selected by the states and UTs by taking into consideration the existing ecosystem of on the ground. What is their expertise? In which product they specialize? Products identified under the districts as exports hub. The finalized list is communicated to the Department of Promotion of Industry and Internal Trade, which is under, obviously, the Ministry of Commerce and Industries by the relevant department of the states and UTs. So that is what you'll have to understand. The overall objective is to make sure that we give impetus to the local manufacturing and we also give impetus to the export aspect. That is what you'll have to understand. Coming to the next topic, this is with respect to the APEC Summit, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, which was held in Gyeongju in South Korea. But Mr. Trump has skipped, and there are many speculations around this. What is the possible reason that Mr. Trump has skipped this particular summit? Chinese leader Xi Jinping told the Asia Pacific leaders on Friday that his country would help to defend the global free trade, as we discussed in the very first topic, that these two countries, US and China, they are now, what they're saying is that we will basically spearhead. Either the US says it or sometimes the China, that we will basically spearhead the aspects of the rules-based order, or let's say the global free trade. China never says rules-based order, but again, it always says that it is better placed to go with the free flow of the trade. On Friday, that his country would help to defend the global free trade at the annual Economic Regional Forum snubbed by US President Trump. She took the center stage at the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation that began on Friday in the South Korean city of Gyeongju. Trump left the country a day earlier after reaching deals with Xi meant to ease their escalating trade war. So again, what we are looking at is a scenario where countries are now striking, especially US and China, bilateral deals, and they're not really interested in these regional forums. This year's two-day APEC Summit has been heavily overshadowed by the Xi meeting that was arranged on the sidelines. Trump described his Thursday meeting with Xi as a roaring success, saying that he would cut tariffs on China, while Beijing had agreed to allow the export of rare earth element and start buying the American soybeans. That is the kind of the bargains which were accepted, right? So that is what you'll have to understand. Their deals were a relief to the world economy rattled by the trade tensions. So whatever they do has obviously an implication on the world economy also. Trump's decision to skip the APEC fits with his well-known disdain for big multi-nation forums that have been traditionally used to address the global problems. So he's not really inclined with respect to these multilateral forums, right? But his blunt dismissal of the APEC risks worsening America's reputation at a forum that represents nearly 40% of the world's population and more than half of the global trade. So in such a type of an organization, if you're not participating, definitely it doesn't go well, right? Established in 1989, during a period of increased globalization, the APEC region faces challenges such as competitions between the US and China, supply chain vulnerabilities with respect to the rare earth element or others, aging population, and the impact of the AI on the jobs. The US strategy has shifted to economic competitions with China rather than cooperation, with Trump's tariff hikes and America First agenda shaking markets and threatening the decades of globalization and multinationalism. So that is what you'll have to understand. The whole objective of Trump is to break these aspects of multilateralism or cooperating with different countries. No, he's saying that let's focus just upon this aspect of the rejuvenation of our own country, and for that we'll do anything whatever is required. Let's talk about the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation. The Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation is a regional economic forum and was formed in 1989. The aim is to leverage the growing interdependence of Asia Pacific and create greater prosperity for the people of the region through regional economic integration. The focus of APEC has been on trade and economic issues, and hence it terms countries as economies. So we do not have member countries in APEC. We have member economies in APEC. It has been operating on the basis of non-binding commitments, with the decision taking through commitments and consensus. Consensus is a very important aspect. Member countries, currently APEC has 21 members. The criteria for membership, however, is that each member must be an independent economic entity rather than a sovereign state. Independent economic entity. That's the reason we have Hong Kong, we have Taiwan as the economy member in the APEC. The grouping's current members, you can just have a look. We also have the as I said, Hong Kong, and we also have Taiwan, right? And we also have the People's Republic of China. Significance of APEC. Since its formation, the grouping has championed the lowering of the trade tariffs, free trade, and economic liberalization. That is what Xi Jinping has been saying, that China is going to lead in this aspect of global free trade. In the Seoul Declaration, the APEC member economies proclaimed creation of a liberalized free trade area around the Pacific Rim as a principal objective of the organization. APEC accounts for nearly 62% of the global GDP. Can you just imagine? Almost 2/3 of the global GDP and nearly half of the global trade. India's willingness. India has been willing to join APEC. India, which presently has an observer status, has been very keen to join the economic grouping. India has expressed the interest in joining the APEC and made a formal request in 1991. The request to join was based on India's geographical location in the having a primary location, a primacy with respect to the Indo-Pacific construct, the potential size of the economy and degree of trade interaction with Asia Pacific, strength of the grouping, why India needs APEC, The grouping represents more than a third of the world population, 47% of the global trade, and almost 60% of the world GDP. Aspiration: India aspires to become a 5 trillion economy and requires 1 trillion for investment in infrastructure, which these countries can definitely help with. Outside the West Europe, most of the capital surplus nations are in the Asia Pacific, which can quench the India's thirst for investment. As we also discussed in the very first topic, that this particular region of Indo-Pacific or Africa or Latin America, there is a thirst with respect to the infrastructure, and we need more funds, and these countries can definitely provide. Natural corollary to the Act East policy, Indians has already become a member of the SCO. Joining APEC is a natural corollary to the Act East policy of India. So therefore, India should definitely join the APEC. That's for this particular article. Let's go to the next. Coming to the next topic, this is with respect to India and US signing a 10-year defense partnership. We'll see what various components of the defense partnership are all about as they continue to negotiate a bilateral trade deal and a thorny issue of tariff penalty by Washington over Delhi's purchase of Russian oil. India and the US on Friday signed a 10-year framework with respect to US-India major defense partnership. Now, this also points towards the close partnership which India has with respect to the US, signaling stable ties between the two countries in the defense sector. The pact was signed following a bilateral meeting between the Defense Minister Rajnath Singh and his US counterpart Pete Hegseth. Now, what you'll have to understand is that they are focusing upon certain key important areas. For example, defense interoperability, logistics, repair, maintenance will be the key component of the framework. India's defense inventory includes US origin wear such as the Super Hercules Globemaster. These are transport aircrafts. Then we have foised-on aircraft, Chinooks, the attack helicopters, for example, the Apaches, the Harpoons, and the M77 howitzers. So you can just look, this is the M77 howitzer, and we also have the MH-60R attack helicopter and the assault rifle also. So we'll have a joint partnership with respect to that. On the sidelines of the 12th ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, in a statement, Ministry of Defense said that the 2025 framework is intended to provide a unified vision and policy direction to deepen the defense cooperation. It said that the framework will usher in a new era in the already strong defense partnership between the two countries. The framework will provide policy direction to the entire spectrum of the India-US defense relationship. The partnership is critical for ensuring a free, open, and rules-based Indo-Pacific region, a reference to the efforts aimed at countering China's aggressive postures. The Secretary of War said that the 10-year framework advances the India-US defense partnership, a cornerstone for regional stability and deterrence. Please understand, we have these dominant military industries in the US, and they would get a kind of a contract for supplying a lot of defense platforms to India. So therefore, it is in a way is boosting American economy. That is also what you will have to understand. A joint statement after the meeting stated, highlighting the deepening convergence of the US-India strategy interests, the leaders reaffirmed their unwavering commitment to a dynamic defense partnership spanning multiple domains. To advance defense ties further, the leaders announced plans to sign this year's a new 10-year framework, right? That is the major defense partnership. Despite the strain in relations between Delhi and Washington over the issue of tariffs and the economy, there has been no visible dip in the military ties. The vision for bilateral defense cooperation was encapsulated in the September 2013 joint US-India Declaration on Defense Cooperation and the 2015 framework on the US-India defense relationship, in which the two countries committed themselves for increasing the cooperation. That is how you use the information. That is how the historical perspective also evolves. Between 16 and 20, the two sides have signed the 4 foundational agreements. We'll talk about that: LEMOA, BECA, COMCASA, and GSOMIA. Right? We have signed the LEMOA, Logistic Exchange Memorandum of Understanding. Then we also signed the COMCASA, that is the Communications Compatibility and Security Arrangement in 2018, and then the Basic Exchange and Cooperation Agreement in 2020. In August 24, both countries also signed Security of Supply Arrangement, SOSA, and the Memorandum of Agreement regarding the assignment of liaison officers among the other bilateral military. So we have been collaborating in different defense domain. In September this year, Indian and American troops participated in the 2-week military exercises Yuddh Abhyas in Alaska. So this was held in Alaska. Big tickets Indian military procurements from the US include MH-60R helicopters. I've already showed you. This is the MH-60R helicopter. Then we have the next, the Sig Sauer rifles. This is the rifle I'm talking about. And then we have the next, that is the M77 howitzer, right? Negotiations are underway to manufacture the jet engines for the LCA Tejas Mark II, and we'll also go with the other unmanned aerial vehicles, right? Then the Hindustan Aeronautics Limited chairman has also said that he did not think that the tariff tensions with the US would affect the discussions of the defense platform. So what we are trying to say is, when we talk about the defense partnership, it is going well. In fact, it is increasing, and it has nothing to do with the tariff aspect, according to what these people are saying. The two leaders said that reviewed the ongoing defense issues and challenges that persist and deliberated upon the ongoing defense industry and technological collaboration. While highlighting that both leaders agreed to work together to address the challenges, it said that the India and the US continue to expand and deepen their defense relationship through military to military exercises and other avenues. Let's look at the 4 foundational agreement, very important. GSOMIA, General Security of Military Information Agreement. So it guaranteed that two countries would protect any classified information or technology that they shared. It was aimed at promoting the interoperability and laid the foundation for future US arms sales to the country. Then we have LEMOA, Logistics Exchange Memorandum of Understanding. To put the usefulness of this agreement in simple terms, it is like being able to stop at a friend's garage or workshop to refuel your own car or get it repaired when you are far away from your own home or workshop. The signing of LEMOA was in itself an affirmation of mutual trust between the two militaries, and its application will enhance the trust. Then we have COMCASA, Communications Compatibility and Security Agreement. The pact allows US to provide India with its encrypted communications equipment and systems so that India and the US militaries, commanders, aircrafts and ships can communicate through secure networks. That is the whole objective. The BECA, Basic Exchange and Cooperation Agreement. It will help India get the real-time access to American geospatial intelligence that will enhance the accuracy of automated systems and weapons like missiles and armed drones, right? So these are the 4 foundational agreement. Definitely India is the major defense partner of the US. Whatever we have the situation with respect to the trade and tariffs, but still we have very close defense partnership. That is what you'll have to understand. Let's go to the next topic. Come to the next topic. This is with respect to decoding the India's projected GDP. So the Union Commerce and Industry Minister has made a statement that in the next 20-25 years, Indian economy would basically become a $30 trillion economy. So in that regard, we have this particular article. India's Commerce and Industry Minister has said that the country does not strike trade deals under duress, under stress. What he's saying is that we basically make trade deals on the basis of our own interest, not under pressure. In the next 20-25 years from now, we'll be a $30 trillion economy. Okay. The key point here is that India's economy is going from strength to strength. And even though at the moment the US economy is almost 8 times the size of the India's economy, in the coming 25 years that gap will be narrowed substantially, because the rate of economic growth of India is much higher than that of the US, right? That is the reason we'll pace up quickly, we'll rapidly have the economic recovery and the growth, and ultimately we'll basically narrow this particular gap which we have with respect to the US. The size of an economy refers to the annual gross domestic product, the GDP, is the total market value of the all goods and services produced within a country, and it gives a sense of the overall heft of an economy, overall weight of the economy in the global affairs. It indicates the relative prosperity and economic vitality of the country, but it does not include the inequality aspect. That is what we'll have to understand. For instance, the US GDP at the end of December 24 was around $29 trillion. In 2024 financial year, India's GDP was $3.9 trillion. The GDP of California, US state, was $4.1 trillion in 2024, higher than that of India, primarily because it houses a lot of technological, very big tech firms, right? For example, Google and others. How is a GDP calculated? A country's GDP is stated in the US dollar terms, so that can be compared easily with the other countries. Calculating the GDP in dollar terms requires taking India's GDP in rupee terms and dividing it with the dollar-rupee exchange rate to arrive at the value in the US dollar terms. And both these are important. Both these matter because the same nominal GDP of 330 trillion rupees in 24 could be converted to make India's GDP a $5 trillion economy if the exchange rate in 2024 was the same as that of 2014. So that also matters. Exchange rate also matters. But since the exchange rate had slipped from around 65 rupees to a dollar in 2014 to 84 rupees a dollar in 2024, India's GDP in dollar terms was still $3.9 trillion. Since the projection is about 25 years into the future, it makes sense to look at how India's economy has grown in the past 25 years. Data reveal that India's nominal GDP has registered a compound annual growth rate of around 11.9% in the last 25 years. So if we were to expect that the economy is going to move with a similar CAGR, then let's see what would happen. Since the financial year 2000, further, the Indian rupee has depreciated against the dollar at a CAGR of 2.7 since 2000. So if we presume that India's growth will be exactly the same and the rupee will depreciate exactly in the same manner over the coming 25 years, then India's GDP will cross $30 trillion in 2048. That's exactly 25 years from now. So this is the blue line, if you can just see. That is what we are talking about. So if we just make the assumption, the presumption that we'll have the same level of economic growth what we had in the last 25 years and the same level of depreciation of the Indian rupee with respect to the US, then it would take another 27 years, right, to reach that mark of 30 trillion US dollars. What is the problem? But India's growth momentum has weakened since 2014. The data revealed that in the past 11 years, the CAGR of nominal GDP has been 10.3%, but the CAGR of rupee depreciation has been more, that is 3%. So if we take on the basis of the last 11 years, things would be different. In other words, the economy is growing at slightly slower rate while the rupee is depreciating at a faster pace. If instead of last 25 years assumption, what we assume is the last 11 years data, the projection for India's GDP goes significantly off course. India's GDP will cross $30 trillion mark around 2055. Is there a big divergence? Is this a big divergence between these two? If you just look, does it really matter? Yes. The difference in the timeline is around 7 to 8 years. In 2055, the India's economy, according to the growth rate based on the past 25 years, would be a whooping 75% bigger than the size of the economy based on the growth rate of the past 11 years. So if you basically take the growth rate of the last 11 years, if we go with a similar economic growth rate, then in 2055, we'll have the X amount. But when we talk about the growth rate which we have witnessed in the last 25 years, if the same were to follow, then in 2055, it would be 75% more with that scenario of the 11 years growth rate. So that is a kind of a difference which you'll have to understand. This data analysis shows that the performance of each decade is important. Moreover, when projecting over the long term, even insignificant looking changes in the growth rate can have big difference. While it is true that the economy grows, its growth rate moderates. India is still too small, especially in relation to the US and China, notwithstanding its ranking among the countries to allow for the growth rate to decelerate. So we should focus upon accelerating our economic growth rate in order to narrow down that difference which we have with respect to the US or China. That is what we are focusing upon. And again, what we have to do, we have to invest in the domestic capacities. Let's go to the last article. Coming to the last topic of today's discussion, this is with respect to the ASHA workers of Kerala who have decided to call off the strike. We'll see what the matter is and what is the construct of ASHA workers. Kerala's accredited social health activists, ASHA workers, who have been striking for the last 265 days demanding enhanced remuneration and retirement benefits, decided to end the strike in front of the secretariat. They'll, however, take the protest to the districts. Understand that these ASHA workers, they form the core, the foundation with respect to delivering the public health services, especially at the grassroots level. But they're not treated as regular employees. Rather, they're treated as volunteers. And they don't get a regular salary. What they get is honorarium, right, which is not fixed, which depends upon the whims and fancies of the state government. So that is something which you'll have to understand. The front line, and this compromises the social security aspect of these ASHA workers. The frontline women health workers decided to end their strike after the Chief Minister said that the monthly honorarium of the ASHAs would be enhanced by 1,000 among other populist measures. The main demand of the Kerala ASHA workers for the association calling for a hike in the honorarium to 21,000 and a lump sum retirement benefit of 5 lakh, because they don't even get that particular benefit, right? No retirement benefit, nothing. And these are the women primarily from the vulnerable sections. So that is, again, it increases the burden. Are to be met. The strike is in the current form is being ended as several demands have been met, said by the association. Let's talk about the ASHA workers. ASHA is a trained female community health activist. The ASHA program was conceived and funded by the National Rural Health Mission, NRHM, in an effort to promote the public health awareness amongst the local rural populations and increase the utilization and accountability of the existing health services. Selected from the community itself and accountable to it, the ASHA will be trained to work as an interface between the community and the public health system. The ASHA scheme is present in place in all states except Goa. The states are mandated to employ at least one ASHA worker per 1,000 people. That is a kind of density which is followed. They receive a basic public health training and are equipped with a standard drug kit which allows them to deliver the first contact healthcare. They are chosen through a rigorous process of selection involving the various community groups, self-help groups, Anganwadi institutions, block nodal officer, and the other aspects. What are the functions? Act as a care provider at the community level, facilitating the access to healthcare, medicine, sanitation services, raising the level of awareness of health issues among the marginalized sections within the community, advocate for the female health and hygiene standards, advocate for a health conscious behavior and approach to livelihood. What is the selection criteria? So in the rural areas, the ASHA must be a woman resident of the village, maybe married or widowed or divorced, but preferably in the age group of 25 to 45 years and literate, qualified up to class 8. In urban areas, ASHAs must be a women resident of a slum, vulnerable clusters, so that they can have, they are related to the people with whom they're working in the area where they're working, right? So that is the reason they must be from that particular area and belong to the particular vulnerable group, which have been identified by the city or district health society for selection of ASHAs and must have a good communication and leadership skills. The states have been given the flexibility to relax the population norms as well as the educational qualifications on a case-to-case basis, because we cannot have a one-size-fits-all approach. So that autonomy is given to the states. What is the compensation? As I told you, that they are not given a regular salary. They are treated as volunteers, primarily an honorary volunteer. So that is a problem, because if they're not having a salary and the other social security benefit, it compromises the very, the very life, because they are not having any cushion, any social security cushion, right? So that is one of the very important facts. But is compensated for the hard time in the specific situations. On average, ASHA workers' monthly income varies from just 2,000 to almost 7,000 per month, depending upon the state. In addition, she is eligible for incentives offered under various national health programs. She would also have an income from the social marketing of certain healthcare products like contraceptives, sanitary napkins. Her work should be designed so that it is done without impinging on her main livelihood, and adequate monetary compensation for the time she spends on these tasks through performance-based payments should also be provided. So again, the whole crux is that many of these ASHA workers have been demanding that they need to have a particular structure, a social security structure in place, so that their life is not compromised, because they work in one of the very hard conditions in the rural areas. They don't have any transport facility, and ultimately they're just getting a kind of honorary and a very small amount. At least increase that amount. That is what they have been demanding. So here we come at the end of the discussion. I hope you found the discussion helpful and fruitful. All the very best. Thank you.